Hello, guys. Welcome. All right. So let me get your names down, okay? Um, I apologize. I will have the assignment up shortly. What I tried to do is, those of you who have taken my 101 class, there's a lot of carryover as I revolve the assignment around Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis on the West. But hopefully you'll see that it has some of the old material, but as well as some new material that's chronologically more relevant to 102. But I wasn't content with that, and I've been reading and prepping and trying to alter and augment the assignment, and I just ran out of time. And I tried to put it up at 3:30, and I had done a Zoom at 2, and it just finished downloading. And while it was downloading, it froze my canvas and I was unable to put it up. So I apologize. I'll have it up shortly after this meeting. It might take, however, after this Zoom meeting downloads. Okay, so sorry about that. So as I'm getting this ready, are there any questions or comments?
When you post that, will you also have the practice test questions up?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, that was really helpful.
Good, good. No, that's good to know, and I'm happy to do that each time, actually. You know what's coming at you. All right. Let's see here. So there are 8 of you. There we go. Sorry. All right, great. All right, I'll put this PowerPoint up as well, okay? So notice here, I want you to be familiar with Turner's thesis, support for Turner's thesis, and then critiques of Turner's thesis regarding the West, particularly theoretical issues, Marxist history, post-civil rights movement historiography or history, and the fact that government aid was given and sometimes necessary. All right, so if you want to write that down. So Turner's thesis, right? Turner's thesis conveys the fact that the West, right, supposedly renewed what our country stands for. And that is equality of opportunity or meritocracy, right? You get what you merit, you get what you earn, what you deserve, what you work for. Okay, so equality of opportunity and meritocracy is to him, right? The West was indiscriminate in its obstacles and in its opportunities. All right, the West was indiscriminate. It didn't play any favorites in its opportunities and in its obstacles. So the obstacles, right? I think of like Joseph Campbell and his writings on American mythology and literature and so forth, where he contends about the hero's journey, that the American dream is all the sweeter when you have to suffer for it, when you have to work hard for it, when you have to face obstacles and overcome said obstacles to get to your goals. So he romanticizes how dangerous, how rough, how difficult Western conditions were. But remember, key to his point is the fact that such obstacles were indiscriminate. And then if you could overcome those obstacles and earn or merit your way up, there were opportunities for anyone for the taking. Okay. And to him, that's what represents Americana. That's what America is all about. So basically, this is court history. This is praising American history as in America itself, in the West in particular, as an exceptional country, an exceptional land where equality of opportunity was cemented when we civilized and settled the West. Very argumentative. All right, very argumentative. So in the next few slides, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to support his thesis and try to convey that image of the West and try to convey an image of there being indiscriminate dangers inherent in Western migration and Western settlement, but yet opportunities there for the taking. Okay. So firstly, right, is the trip itself, right? You look at historians like Candy Moulton, you look at old school historians like Clifford Westermeyer, you look at Paul Johnson and his History of America, and these are court historians, okay? And they somewhat adhere to Turner's thesis in their books, and they convey an image of the West being rowdy, rough, dangerous, but yet for everyone. So you look at the overland trips, right? The overland trails in the 1840s and 50s. And you could find evidence of those trails being laden with several obstacles. Remember, the Native Americans, by the time of the Trail of Tears and by the mid to late 1830s, America began heavily flirting with the idea of reservations for Native Americans. And with those reservations is, America, and before them, England, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Euro-Americans, as they're called, have developed a bad reputation for finding anyone they can to, quote, touch the white man's pen and sign the treaties. And it happened so often that the legitimate leaders did not sign the treaties that they have the euphemism treaty chiefs, who were really not the chiefs at all, but signed the treaties, right? And so sometimes you have that issue. Then you have issues like in this time period with the Sioux in particular up in the Northern Plains, whereby they're going to split in half. They and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, between those leaders who did succumb or give in to the conditions of the treaties and those who rebelled against them and said no and refused. All right. A classic example is Spotted Tail. Spotted Tail, most of his followers went against him when he signed the Fort Laramie Treaty in Wyoming. So you have treaties like, you could look these treaties up separately if you like. You have Medicine Lodge, right? You have Fort Atkins, Adkins. And then you have a couple treaties at Fort Laramie, Laramie. And what they'll try to do, right, is they try to confine certain tribes to certain areas in the West. And then they try to give the right of safe conduct or passage for white settlers to come through their territory. All right. Well, with the settlers coming through, oftentimes their cattle, their pigs, etc., would mess up, destroy Native American horticulture, their farming, their crops, right, and mess up their ecosystem. And coming through, they would hunt the bison and other animals that were heavily relied upon by the Native American tribes. So hence they were a nuisance. And then, of course, as they would travel through, you would have inevitable altercations and people firing upon one another with a Remington rifle, the Colt 6-shooter, right? People were oftentimes armed. And so violence could ensue and did. And then you have the fact that some of them broke their word and they began to settle in those areas instead of just simply passing through. especially when you had mining bonanzas. You had in the 1860s, you had the Comstock lode in Nevada. You had in the 1860s and 1870s, you had Boise and other areas of Idaho and Montana, as well as the Dakotas of thousands of miners coming in, although they were not supposed to, according to these treaties. They were simply supposed to travel through. So then when altercations ensued, lobbyist groups and imperialists in Congress and in the Secretary of the Interior, which controlled the Indian Bureau under the president, they began arguing the Fifth Amendment and stated that, wait a minute, the federal government is entitled to protect the life, liberty, and property of American citizens. So according to the Fifth Amendment, the Secretary of the Interior, as well as leaders of the Trans-Missouri Theater of the Army, those beyond the Missouri River to the west, decided that there needed to be a string of forts, right, of federal forts to protect the lives of Americans coming through that territory from Native Americans. The most infamous was the Bozeman Trail, Bozeman. So the Native Americans, oftentimes like Red Cloud of the Sioux, were not having this at all. So they began fighting Red Cloud as well as a young warrior named Crazy Horse against the Bozeman Trail. And that in and of itself started a Sioux war, okay? Then you had the problem of promising them annuities, right? Like annual, the word annual, yearly shipments of goods. And to a lot of people today, they find this to be, almost like domesticating an animal, a mechanism of control to get them dependent upon the federal government for their food and for their necessities. And so what made matters worse is back in Minnesota in particular, the annuities failed to materialize. And so the young Native warriors in particular, and oftentimes there was a dichotomy, the young warriors oftentimes were not okay with terms dictated to them, and the elder men were more fatalistic and gave their okay to it. And so you had schisms within the tribes themselves again. But the young warriors in particular, they left the Minnesota reservations, they began hunting. And then an altercation ensued and they killed a couple settlers. So that began another war. And then I kid you not, another war was begun over a darn stray cow with a Brule Sioux. And a guy named Grattan, Grattan, killed the Brule chief. And then the warriors killed Grattan and some of his men. And that started a third Sioux war. So you had isolated incidents. You had the tension of white settlement coming into their lands. You had the contention that Native Americans were not, did not truly have a say or the latitude to truly say no to these treaties, right? And so all that is going to exacerbate any tension that was already there. So when people were coming through the overland trails, they're going to be attacked by certain tribes, in particular the Sioux, the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Shoshone, the Comanche, and the Apache. And you don't need to memorize those tribes, but I'm just letting you know, okay? And so that added to Turner's thesis, right? That there were dangers inherent in crossing into the West, in particular Native American attacks, or at the very least, Native Americans extorting them, stopping them at gunpoint, demanding their horses, some of their goods in return for their lives. So you have Native American troubles. Then you also have, of course, accidents, disease, the vagaries of weather, stampedes from buffalo or from cattle, you name it, it could happen in the West, all right? Especially going across several different types of ecosystems. You have the Great Basin, which is desert-like. You have mountain ranges like the Mandan, the Sierra Nevada, and the Rockies. You have treacherous rivers like the Platte, the Columbia, and the Snake. And it just adds to a pretty dramatic crossing. So yeah, so at any rate, you could look up a guy named Robert Stewart and look at his biography of crossing the West, and you find all the different things, even including bear attacks that you have stereotypically seen in Western movies and Western novels, etc., romanticizing the dangers of the West. Then you have the fact that there genuinely were areas in the West clear up into the 1870s of anarchy. Because remember, the Louisiana territory that was purchased was much grander than Louisiana state, right? It's going to involve over 20 future states. And so some of these states, like Wyoming, don't become states until 1869. And so they're federal territory, right? Organized territory. And so when they had mining bonanzas and gold and silver rushes, etc., people swarmed in, and they didn't have land development happen yet under the Northwest ordinances. They're supposed to survey everything into 6 square acre plots. So many of them were to make a county, so many of those to make a state. Then they were to have a local constable or sheriff and a police department and all of that. Well, a lot of that didn't materialize yet. And so in the West, this lends to this rugged Turner type image of the West, right? Where people are going to have to form vigilante groups to take law into their own hands, where federal marshals and deputies are going to be sent all the way from Oklahoma and in some cases even Virginia to New Mexico or to Wyoming to capture a list, dead or alive, of suspects. You're going to have judges, again, all the way from Oklahoma, making decisions about capturing and bringing and giving some semblance of due process to suspects all the way, close to California, Nevada, Colorado, etc. So you literally had a semblance of anarchy, of no government, of no police infrastructure and government infrastructure in some of these places. And the most famous were the cattle towns and the mining towns. The mining towns, it goes without saying, right? That they're the towns where a bonanza would happen, thousands of people would rush in, and they hadn't developed any infrastructure yet. The cattle towns were famous by Joseph G. McCoy, whereby in like Abilene, Kansas, Dodge City, Kansas, they would establish a depot, a train depot, and the famous cattle trails. The most famous were the Chisholm Trail, Chisolm, the Sedalia Trail, Sedalia, okay, the Good Night and Loving Trail, Good Night, one word, and Loving, one word, the last names of 2 gentlemen that made the trail famous. They would take thousands of head of cattle up these trails, and they would take them to the nearest train depot to sell them for profit. And they would make handsome profits in these cattle towns. And it said that just like with the Transcontinental Railroad, that would-be entrepreneurs or business beginners would be licking their lips to try to mine the people in these cattle towns and to try to get that money right out of their pockets, to try to provide some type of good or service, right, that would be of interest to these young cattlemen. And so at any rate, the cattle towns and the mining towns developed a reputation for lawlessness, for vigilante groups coming up, for federal marshals having gunfights with outlaws, etc. Okay, even Baxter and Caldwell in New Mexico, they actually deputized every person in the town and allowed them to be armed and to shoot on sight certain outlaws if they were to return to the town. The Shirley gang, Bob Shirley's group, went into Meeker, Colorado, and as they were holding up the bank, a guy of his Hugus store, Hugus, the Hugus store was across the street, and the owner handed out guns to everybody in town, and they surrounded the bank and they shot down the members of the Shirley gang as they came out with the money. And so, you have some cases where you could arguably say only in the West at this time period would something crazy like this happen, right? And this kind of lends credence to a certain degree to Turner's thesis of a rough and tumble West. Okay. And then, of course, you have the infamous sheriffs in the cow towns and in the mining towns, like Tom Bear River Smith, who was killed, Wild Bill Hickok, who killed 8 men. And a handful of the 8 had nothing to do with breaking the law, but had personal altercations with him, like a gentleman named Davis Tutt. He got in an argument with over a poker match and ended up shooting and killing while he was wearing the badge in that city. And so you see evidence of kind of blurred lines, if you will, between law and order. And that all lends credence to this whole thing. And of course, Wyatt Earp and Tombstone, right? The fight at the OK Corral with the Clantons and the McClorys, and them killing and wounding 2 of his brothers, and him utilizing that badge to go after his enemies. And so you have that. You also have the famous case of, I'm going to go back to that, Billy the Kid, right? And the Lincoln County Wars in New Mexico, whereby he was working for a well-to-do Scottish immigrant who outbid the local sheriff and a local guy named Murphy for the cattle, his cattle, to be bought and eaten by the local army and fort. And he was blatantly murdered. And so Billy the Kid and others are gonna fight against Murphy and the local sheriff. They're gonna kill the local sheriff, and you're gonna have this, fight between law and order and so forth. You see there up at the top, that is Hardin. His last name was Hardin, and he killed 8 men of the law before he was shot in the back of the head by a lawman in a saloon. John Wesley Hardin was his name. So, like I said, to an extent, you could argue and say only in the West does stuff like this happen. Now, I want to bring a caveat to this. There's an historians like Carl Metz, M-E-T-Z, and he writes books and contends that the West was not numerically, statistically as violent as the image is conveyed. He even goes on to contend that places like the 5 Points in New York had a higher per capita murder rate than Dodge City and Abilene and Deadwood. And so that's something to keep in mind. And that there might have been, deliberate hyperbole, deliberate exaggeration in the press and the image of some of these Western towns. Okay. But going back to this, there was money to be made. Look at Virginia City in Nevada. 135 million was extracted. People like John McKay, James Fair, James Flood, William O'Brien went from rags to riches, known as Bonanza Kings. The Comstock lode yielded $300 million, Montana 20 million. Okay. And so you do have evidence of people, and back in your 101 class, the 48ers, right, before 49, who came. You look at the Alta California and other Spanish-speaking newspapers in California, and they conveyed that the average person with no capital, no training, no fancy equipment was extracting a lot of wealth early on in the gold rush. All right, so that is something to consider in support of Turner's thesis. Also, access to land. The federal government made this possible, though, you guys. The Homestead Act of 1862 allotted 160 acres of free land if you would vow to cultivate it, to stay on it and not sell it for 5 years, and if you vowed loyalty to the Union in the midst of the Civil War, you could be granted this land. And look at this, from 1860s to 1900, over 300,000 Danish alone immigrants came in and gained access to title to land. So a lot of Scandinavians, Norwegians and Danes and Swedes came in, and from the Ukraine and Russia, etc., came in and did well as far as land ownership and farming in the high plains and in the Ohio Valley in the mid to late 1800s. So not just opportunity for Americans, but also for immigrants, right, to gain access to land. Also, it was arguably archaic to keep the price at $1.25. That had been set by Congress from the time virtually of the founding fathers. And the government deliberately kept the asking price of the public domain to $1.25, where land was surveyed and sold and auctioned off, etc. So they deliberately kept the land affordable. Paul Johnson, a court American historian, contends, and he challenges other historians to show him a comparable case of any other country in modern history that showed such extravagant, benevolent generosity regarding land ownership to more people through things like the Homestead Act. All right. Not to mention squatters' rights. You could come in, and if land had not been cultivated within a decade, you could squat on that land, begin cultivating it, and there was a broad array of things because it wasn't at the national level. It was like English common law. It was constantly evolving, and it was going on a case-by-case basis. But you could either gain the first rights to purchase it, or you could even be granted that land for free outright. And remember, this became popularly utilized in the courts during the time of Andrew Jackson in your 101 class, squatters' rights, because it became a tool, right? A useful tool to gaining votes from the voters, from your poor voters who are ambitious and want land. All right. So you also have squatters' rights to consider. And then again, I'm going to kind of skip over this with the Germans and the other groups because we're going to go over it again with the Gilded Age. But the Germans did very well in areas like St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Chicago. The Germans in particular came in, and some of them had been part of the failed push or coup of 1848 in the mid 1800s. And they came here and they brought the kindergarten system and systems of opera, gymnasium, and physical education in school. A lot of inventions as far east as Pennsylvania with a Conestoga wagon and one of the famous rifles. And so the Germans did very well as well, and very quickly became entrepreneurs. They came with capital. They were dairy farmers as well. And of course, they became famous for the breweries of making, distilling beer. And they did very well for themselves because in the West, right, the gateways to the West were mainly the butchering sites of Cincinnati, mainly with pork, and Chicago, mainly with cattle or beef. So Chicago and Cincinnati took off in the mid to late 1800s, connected to the railroads and to the cattle bonanza in the West. And remember, with the cowboys, right, you could come down and at any given time, there were, oh my goodness, there were over 5 million cattle roaming freely in southern Texas. And about 500,000, about 500,000 cowboys independently went into southern Texas and drove the cattle up to the nearest depots in Kansas and Missouri and made an incredible profit from them. If it was unbranded and you took it and you could make it across the long trail, sometimes up to 1,000 miles, it was yours for free. And it sold in 1873. A 1,000-pound steer was selling for about $74 in Chicago. And that was back then. So that's just one. So the cowboy had his heyday from the end of the Civil War till about the mid 1880s. when there became a glut in the beef industry and things began to go awry internationally. But until then, you had kind of arguably the heyday of the cowboy, and that was another entrepreneurial opportunity for someone. All right, again, other groups, Russians, Poles, Austrians, Romanians, Slovaks, Serbs, Croatians, Bulgarians, Jewish community, right? 13 million foreign born by 1910, and a lot of them moved into the West. So Italian wine and fruit growers in California, etc. So they did well for themselves here in the West. And so to Turner, right, that's Americana. That's opportunity for anyone, including immigrants, who was enterprising enough, lucky enough, hardworking enough, etc., to make it in the West. I'll post this PowerPoint, okay? So, like I said, with the cattle industry, then even if you had to purchase a cow in Texas, oftentimes in the 1860s and early 1870s, it was no more than $10 a head. And like I said, you could get up to about $75 a head in the Eastern markets. So incredible profit margin. And opportunities for, along with the railroads, came access to bankers and creditors, lenders, basically. And so it became very feasible to be able to buy a few acres at $1.25 an acre. And oftentimes, break even by at least your, if not your first, your second harvest. However, you have naysayers who show that, boy, you really did need access to credit, because on the average, I should have the numbers. I'll try to find them and put them on this PowerPoint slide, okay? Because I have them on another PowerPoint slide, but I have exact numbers. But if my memory serves me correctly, when you look at buying a minimal amount of acreage and sowing the seeds for, oftentimes it was wheat on the plains for some type of cash crop, and then getting it to the market and having it sold, and everything with cultivation and harvesting, and then eating and subsisting, just living in that meantime, that before and moving to the West and before your first income came in, that it would cost you from $750 to $1,300. So some people contend that the really poor couldn't move West. They couldn't afford it. Or if they did, they had to improvise and engage in some type of entrepreneurial activity that yielded a much quicker profit and much less overhead or initial expenses than cash crop farming if they wanted to move to the West. So all of this is contested, right? There are facts to show the contrary, or facts that are conveniently being omitted in what I'm sharing right now to try to support Turner's thesis. Okay. And of course, mining the miners or mining the cowboys with some type of service or good. So opposition to his thesis. For one, theoretically, some historians don't like the simplistic causation instead of just correlation of a frontier ecosystem developing a democratic society, or everyone on equal footing, egalitarian society. You look at Brazil, you look at Argentina and other areas of a frontier. They didn't develop really equality of opportunity. They didn't develop arguably an egalitarian or democratic society. And in his book, he tries to convey that that is a natural, almost symptom or addendum to having a frontier, is that it almost guarantees you that type of society. So some people disagree with his premise right from the get-go. Others contend, like I said, that the West was not truly as dangerous as they contend, that he exaggerates on the obstacles to be overcome. And then, of course, many contend that equality of opportunity was not absolute, that it might have been relative, that maybe compared to the East Coast, there were more opportunities for more people. But on an absolute basis, there did not exist true, genuine equality of opportunity. All right. And now we're going to get into that. The first segment is Marxist history, right? And remember, with Marxist historians, they contend that the capitalist system in particular, that is inherently parasitical. For someone to win, someone else has to lose. And they vilify or make villains of the winners, and contend that they cheat, they had undue advantages that others didn't have, and that the system is not fair. Okay. So the railroads, they play the perfect villain. You look at books on the Transcontinental Railroad, just in particular, just that railroad alone, the Union Pacific coming from the east, right? Nebraska and Kansas area, heading east into Utah, and then the Central Pacific coming from California to the Utah. And you find a lot of evidence of taking advantage of political connections or political leverage or political capital, as they call it, right? So you see here, Aaron Sargent in the House, James McDougall in the Senate had a lot to do with giving subsidies to these railroads. And they were, and in supporting this, they suddenly came into ownership of a large share of stock in each of the railroads. So that's probably not a coincidence. They were probably somewhat bribed, or is somewhat of a quid pro quo agreement, right? You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So oftentimes, right, they would be granted up to 16,000 acres on each side of the railroad tracks, free land given by the federal government to help them be able to afford laying down the tracks. And the argument goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, that he wanted infrastructure to develop commerce and communication and transportation, and that if you let the system stay completely private, people will not choose to do it for the simple reason that it involves too much, what's the expression, deferred gratification, that there's too much overhead, too much money that has to be spent before a single cent of profit ever comes in, that people would rather do something else with their money and engage in some other type of venture, so that the government arguably has to make it worthwhile for them and helping them out with such an expensive venture that's supposed to help benefit the entire country and the entire American economy. So therefore, they granted land, thousands of acres of land. It ended up amounting to about 20, oh gosh, let me look at my Howard Zinn here. He gives some numbers right away in his chapter, Robber Barons and Rebels. Let's see here. The Central Pacific started on the West Coast going east. It spent $200,000 in Washington on bribes to get 9 million acres of free land and 24 million in bonds. Because remember, with bonds, right, the people purchase a bond certificate and the government owes them that money back plus interest. And so the governments at all the different levels, the city, county, state, and federal levels, were issuing bonds to help the railroads out. So they got a lot of help, okay? And so as they're coming through, they had precedent. And not to mention with a land surveying, there was a lot of bribery and corruption. Abraham Lincoln himself was okay with considering the beginnings of the Sierra Nevada about 24 miles further west than they really are, for the Central Pacific to begin to get higher subsidies, because you get a certain subsidy of land and money if it's flat land, a certain amount if it's hill laden, and then a certain amount if it is mountainous. And of course, you get the most if it's mountainous, because it's the assumption that that's going to be more expensive to have to use nitroglycerin and black powder to blast through the mountainsides, right? To tunnel through. So at any rate, there was corruption that way. Both the Union and the Central Pacific devised their own construction companies made up of the owners of the Union and Central Pacific. So they made up their own kind of dummy construction company and paid themselves with other people's money to build the railroad. And they exaggerated the prices for everything and were paid at an inflated price. And it even went so far with the Credit Mobilier, the construction company owned by the Durant and the leaders of the Union Pacific in the East, that they even paid themselves for bridges that were never even built. And it became a well-known scandal. And then Muscle Sloth down in Southern California. They come in and they're a group of farmers who are squatting on land, and they've been granted that land by squatters' rights by a local judge. So they were already farming it, considering it their own under legal title. Well, the Topeka Santa Fe Railroad comes in to Southern California and says, nope, this is our land. We own so much of it to the east and west, the north and south of our tracks, and you're on it. So get off. They refused. They went and got a local, the railroad got an injunction to try to force them off. They still refused. They brought a federal deputy and marshal. They shot at them and killed one of them. So then the Santa Fe Railroad used its connections to get a regiment of soldiers, of American soldiers, to come in and fight these squatters and force them off the land. That was here in Southern California. And so the railroads prevailed. They became proverbially the bullies. And what do you know? When they started developing cities and depots along the railroad tracks, they began with their starting price at about $5.50 an acre. And remember, the government was charging $1.25 an acre. So they hiked up their prices exorbitantly high, trying to maximize their profits. So the railroads really played the villain. And then not to mention also is the railroads, before an act in 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act, that act mandated that they had to have the same rates, railroad rates of transportation and movement, right, for everyone, and that those rates had to be reasonable and just. So before that Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, they could charge people whatever they wanted. And so if they found isolated homesteaders who had just fewer than 100 acres and they're raising their crop and they're desperately needing to sell it on the railroad, they put an exorbitantly high price per pound for their crop and stuck it to the little guys. And the small scale cash crop farmers were furious because they didn't want to be just subsistence farmers and grow their own food. They wanted to achieve the American dream. They wanted to sell a crop for cash and rise up and make money, right? They were aspiring capitalists, and the middlemen were sticking it to them. All right. They also bought lands under dummy names and then consolidated all that land. And people, because they knew that the purchasers oftentimes would not sell their land to the Central Pacific. And so they used dummy names. They had ways of like I said, using different corrupt practices. Graft was when they knew ahead of time, they had secret information about the development of where the train tracks were going to go and what cities were going to develop and what areas. And they would purchase that land first on inside information. So hence graft. So a lot of this was going on, and fraud, etc. Then corporate farmers, look at this. Harvesting an acre of wheat entailed 61 hours of labor. Before the Civil War, it entailed only 3 hours and 19 minutes after the Civil War, according to Howard Zinn. So the mechanical reaper, the thresher, the harvester combine, these were expensive machines that the average person could not afford. So then what the big guys could do is they could use economies of scale, just their quantity alone. They could put a lower price on their commodities. And not to mention, they were getting rebates from the railroads. What Rockefeller did with his oil is they would say, okay, what are you going to do for me, railroad? If I promise you, you could charge me by the pound, and I promise you 8 tons of wheat, during harvest time per week, that'll give you a lot of money. What are you going to do in return for me? And so, okay, we'll give you a 50% rebate on the price per pound. But of course, they wouldn't give that rebate to the smaller farmers. So all that's interesting and connected, right, to a challenge to Turner's thesis, right? According to Marxist historians, saying, no, I think the West was no different from anywhere else, especially in a capitalist economy. The big guys, the little guys had no chance against the big ones. The big corporate farmers just muscled out the smaller guys. The big railroads just muscled out everyone else. So then the Grangers erupted at this time, and the small scale farmers began to organize. You could see evidence of this in Newman and Patterson and other areas here in the Central Valley, down by what you might call the dairy belt here in the valley. They began to organize with one another. They sometimes collectively shared assets, property, not property, but machinery. Assets, machinery, collectively got loans together and paid them back collectively to try to give themselves a fighting chance against the big guys. And then they also, in the Granger units, and in addition to sharing information, giving a sense of camaraderie, a sense of help for one another. And remember, this goes against Turner's thesis of rugged individualism, right? Because they're helping one another. They also wanted laws implemented that helped them. And the most famous laws were the laws against the middlemen. They wanted laws like the Interstate Commerce Act eventually of 1887 that would limit what the middlemen who were charging their freight of their stuff and transportation wise, or storage of their stuff, what they could charge them. They wanted to put price ceilings on them and keep them fair as prices. And they also began organizing a third political party known as the Populist Group, or the Populist Party. And they even became organized enough and organized enough resources to run candidates for the presidency. And in 1896, they gave the haves, if you will, a good scare. They showed promise in that presidential election under William Jennings Bryan. But he lost to McKinley. And so at any rate, you have the Grangers and the Populists as evidence of discontent amongst the small scale farmers. And then in mining, it was the pneumatic and hydraulic drills, the air powered and water powered drills, big, expensive machinery that the average people could not afford. And what do you know? According to Alan Brinkley in our textbook, most wealth was extracted as minor minerals like copper, and was extracted hundreds and hundreds of feet inside the veins of caves and mountainsides. So hence could not be extracted by a mere pickaxe or something affordable for the average miner. So the corporate mines extracted the majority of the wealth. Yes, you had your bonanza winners, but liken it a little bit to a casino where you see one individual and 10 trips to the casino win big on a slot machine, but everybody else is giving their money to the casino. And so at any rate, that's what you see here in Marxist histories of the mining realm in the West, the mining industry. And then you see a special exploitation and discrimination, extra obstacles thrown before Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, as well as Hispanic or Latino Americans and immigrants. And remember, this goes against Turner's thesis of equality of opportunity. So with both groups, a term that's often used is proletarianization. All right. Proletarianization. I have it in a couple slides from here, and I'm going to try to write it right here. Remember, Marxist proletariat is the laboring class in an industrial society, but it's more than that. It's hinted that the laboring class is stuck. It's statically stuck in that class, and they cannot rise. All right. So to what extent did Hispanic and Asian Americans and immigrants experience proletarianization? Getting pigeonholed into the proletariat, unable to extract themselves from it. Now, granted, with the Asians, right? What's interesting is Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki is a tremendous book that I'd highly recommend on this subject. But at any rate, he conveys a common theme is that jealousy, right? Fear of losing what you hold dear and what you covet. That jealousy, economic jealousy, played a huge role in anti-Asian sentiment and discrimination. That the Asians developed such a good reputation for being successful, for being diligent, hardworking, for being efficient, getting a lot done in a small window of time. And also for being docile, doing as they're told, right? That reputation for them being the ideal worker brought about, ironically, discrimination because of economic jealousy, that they were going to take white men's jobs. All right. So Crocker and others coming back from the coolie system, they sent agents to the Guangdong province of China. They'd had their opium wars, the Taiping Rebellion, right? And so they were push and pull factors for the Chinese to move out. A lot of them went first to the Hawaiian Islands and then into California, and especially during the gold rush. And so as they came in, Charles Crocker made a famous bet that his Chinese workers could lay a mile of track in a day, and they easily did more than that. And there was a lot of publicity about it, etc. And he ended up hiring 14,000 Chinese immigrants to work the Central Pacific Railroad. And they had a reputation for diminutive size as well, small size. So they put them in small crags within the mountainsides. They put them in reed baskets and hanged them off the sides of the mountains and had them chip nitroglycerin chips into the side of the mountains to explode, hoping that they would be pulled up in time, that they didn't die during the explosion. 1,200 of them died building the railroad. 1,200. So as they began to do well in the gold rush and to do well for the Central Pacific Railroad, discrimination increased. So you have the 1850 and 1852 foreign miners license tax laws against them. You have the 1855 tax on passengers ineligible for citizenship, a $50 tax on Chinese immigrants, which was huge back then. 1858, California passed an act to prevent the further immigration of Chinese or Mongolians. They called them Mongolians because of the dynasty, and they called their system, their country, the Celestial Kingdom. So they oftentimes, when you look at the primary sources, they called them Mongolians or Celestials. And look at this, in 1870, Congress passed a law declaring Asians unfit for naturalization. Unfit for naturalization. They couldn't become citizens. So we had our own Staten Island here known as Angel Island, and we tried to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. No Chinese laborers allowed. And it lasted until 1943. So this flies in the face of Turner's thesis, right? Equality of opportunity for all people. And then with Latinos or Hispanics, they oftentimes were faced by law discrimination and de facto, then just in actuality and reality, but not necessarily by law, discrimination and segregation. And what did they do? They fought within the system, they fought beyond the system, and they maintained their culture very effectively. Right, so a lot of them came and worked as ranch hands or vaqueros or cowboys. But by this time, right, the heyday of the cowboy was done because the big cattle ranchers and farmers bought up most of the land and used barbed wire and enclosed their lands. And so now they became just daily ranch hands on farms and ranches, especially in Texas and Colorado. And immigration picked up at this time as corporations began to take over mining, farming, and ranching because there was a great demand for manual labor, right? Exploitable, proletariat-oriented labor. And so it was pretty predictable, supposedly, where they would go is oftentimes just the nearest proximity. So Coahuila and Chihuahua, they'd go to Texas. Sonora and Sinaloa, they'd go to California. And they worked as cooks, cleaners, dishwashers, and other menial jobs, especially in border towns like Corpus Christi, Texas. And they worked as miners in Anaconda copper mines of Arizona, hired predominantly Hispanic laborers. So did the Santa Fe and Topeka Railroad. But they were not paid well. And on occasions, like in Santa Clara County in the 1870s, they struck. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't, in getting better wages and conditions. There did develop an exception on the Mexican bourgeoisie. Remember, that just literally means people of the city. So people that are connected to white collar jobs, right? Middle class. So like the literati, the college educated writers and lawyers, etc., right? And then of course, entrepreneurs, business owners. And a lot of them focused in just a few Western cities like Los Angeles, San Antonio, Texas, and Tucson, Arizona. And then in Southern Texas began the beginnings of what we're familiar with now with corporate owned cash crop farming. And so in Southern Texas, especially between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers, a lot of Mexican immigrants came up and worked as day laborers. However, in California, up until about 1900, most of the laborers that were exploited in the fields were still Asians. In particular, not just Chinese and Japanese, but also Filipino laborers. And that will change in the early 1900s, as most of us think of with California labor because of now and because of subsequent generations of like Cesar Chavez. A hierarchy developed amongst the Hispanics. And sometimes, right, in the Chicano history books, they vilify the well-to-do Hispanics as being kind of sellouts and using the poor masses of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, using them as the middlemen, as the brokers, providing them as laborers for the big corporate ranches and mining companies, etc., and getting a cut for themselves in doing so. So that's another theme you find in the Chicano history books. And then you have downright violence. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but just you have border wars, merchant wars, the Salt War in New Mexico, fighting over resources, fighting over access to goods, fighting over the right to sell products in certain markets. And sometimes it devolved into physical violence between Anglos and Hispanics. So it got ugly. And Occupied America is an interesting book on the topic. So there were lynchings. Notice the populists, right? The populists did not allow Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants to be represented in their party and in their labor unions. Same thing with the Irish here in California, because they felt competitive with Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. They didn't allow either group to be represented in their labor unions. An interesting group that fought back were the gorras blancas, or the white caps, the white hats, and they had politicians run for office. They cut barbed wire off the wealthy and would steal some of their cattle and try to give it to the poor. Very, very interesting case of kind of a nebulous line between legal and extra legal fighting on behalf of Hispanics in the white caps, or the gorras blancas. It's an interesting topic. And then some fought outside the system, like Gregorio Cortez, Chino Cortina, and of course, Joaquin Murrieta, that Zorro is fashioned after. So they became known as bandidos, right? And that they were engaging in social banditry, that they were fighting against a system that they felt was inherently racist and didn't give their people a chance, a fighting chance to fight fair and square. And then some, like I said, gave in and even cooperated with the Anglo corporations and businesses, like the Santa Fe Ring. You could look that up. That's an interesting case in and of itself, of Hispanic and Anglo partners, lawyers, ranchers, mining operators, just a whole gambit of bankers, all in it together. But they bent the law on several occasions to enrich themselves and one another. All right, so all this was meant to convey a challenge to Turner's thesis and his point that there was equality of opportunity in the West, right? And saying, no, when I look at the Asian Americans, when I look at the Hispanic Americans, I don't see equality of opportunity. When I look at Marxist history, and I look at the well-to-do corporations and how they had certain privileges and powers that they flaunted over the less well-to-do, I don't see equality of opportunity. And then a group that was downright arguably marginalized, just kicked to the corner and not given a chance at all, the Native Americans, right? So like I mentioned, at the treaties, they were supposed to allow safe passage, and then it would change, and they would allow miners to come in when gold or silver was discovered in certain areas. Fort Laramie had to be redone like 3 times, for instance. The Native Americans certainly did not unanimously agree to these terms to begin with. Certain leaders of the Department of the Interior and of the armed forces of the Army in the theater west of the Missouri River easily play the villains. You had isolated incidents like those Sioux in Minnesota that were hunting and killed some settlers, and a fight over a darn cow between Groton and the Brule chief. And then it somewhat culminates with General Sheridan, where he contends that it doesn't matter if you agree to the terms or not, that if you do not locate yourself on your reservation at a certain time of the year, you are to be declared on the site a hostile and could be shot on the spot. So Red Cloud and Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, as well as most of the men under Spotted Tail, for the Sioux in particular, began gathering with Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors in the Powder River Valley of Montana, knowing that the army was going to come for them. And then, of course, you have George Armstrong Custer. Now, today in history books, he's depicted as a microcosm of the typical pale-faced, arrogant man who came in thinking he was going to wipe them out with inferior numbers. He took hostages in the form of women and children at the Washita River and began killing the women and children when the exchange didn't go well, so he could be very ruthless. He was out for a lot of attention as far as for the press. So he plays the easy villain. But back then, right? Back then, all that was undone by his death. Because as you might guess, his death was viewed in the press as a martyrdom. So he split his men into three groups. In the groups of just roughly over 100. Sent Marcus Reno into the Little Bighorn to the south of the village to attack. And there were 2,000 warriors there. Reno, his men were routed and retreated, and he waited on the northern end of Little Bighorn, waiting arrogantly, thinking that they were going to be running for their lives, trying to escape in the north, and he was going to clean them up. And instead, within minutes, he and his just over 100 men of the 7th Cavalry were wiped out by native warriors who also had repeating rifles at Little Bighorn. It's a fascinating place if you get a chance to visit it. So after that, right? After that, things got only worse. And then, of course, during those Sioux wars that I mentioned prior, Governor Evans of Colorado and Colonel Shivington of Colorado, they use as an excuse the fact of the war with the Sioux in Minnesota, and said, well, technically, they like to spread message to their conch shell to their allies that if war's fought in Minnesota, then it's going to be fought in Denver also, which technically historically had been the case. But the Cheyenne who were there as the allies to the Sioux, they asked to seek peace and said they wanted no part of this Sioux war, one of at least 3 Sioux wars. And they were promised if they settled near Sand Creek, they would be considered set aside. And Shivington and his men in the early hours of the morning, supposedly a lot of his men were inebriated, came in and massacred the Cheyenne. And then the famous coup de grace could be argued in the Ghost Dance episode, right? At Wounded Knee in the 1890s, where the Sioux and other tribes were developing a dance and meeting under a charismatic leader, contending that if they did return to their proper gods and to their proper rituals, that they could, that their their great being would wipe out the pale face for them, primarily through disease. And in doing the dance, they were told that they could not do it. And authorities came to apprehend them. And they said that a mute Native American accidentally had his gun fire off. And they butchered everyone there at Wounded Knee. So like I said, another source of contention was the Bozeman Trail, these federal fort trails. Red Cloud and the other young warriors fought against it. The fact that they were supposed to be on reservations, but they never given their okay to be mandated to be on such reservations. The role of Philip Sheridan himself and his decree, his harsh decree. So if you would, okay, like I said, as soon as this video downloads, I'll be able to put up the assignment finally. I'll send you an announcement letting you know. But it's the same as usual. Please be sure to read the entire document and then just choose one section to analyze and evaluate due next Sunday evening by midnight. All right, are there any questions? You guys feel okay on this? Any thumbs up? Thank you, Jaden. Thank you, Narayan. All right, thank you, Laura. All right, well, you guys have a nice week, okay? Canvas, message me if you have any issues. Any emergencies, I left you a cell phone number.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaden. Appreciate having you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Narayan. All right, have a good evening, okay, you guys?
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you for hanging in there. Have a good day.